Be right back.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. It's so good to see so many people here today. Like I said, we will get underway in just 2 minutes. We'll have a bit of a welcome from me, and then Tim Devitt will take over with his presentation. All right, we're right at the top of the hour, so I want to get us started. We only have a brief time together today. Thank you for joining this series, Alcohol is Still a Drug, an exploratory series. Today is the 8th in a session that's been going on most of the year. And this, we're welcoming Tim Devitt to talk about the impact of alcohol use on individuals with mental illness. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes Addiction, Mental Health, and Prevention TTCs under cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. The 3 TTCs believe that words matter, and we use affirming language in all our activities. A few housekeeping items. If you're having technical issues, please individually message me, Rebecca Buller. Alyssa is not here this morning, so it's just me in the chat section, and I'll do my best to help. Please put questions for Tim in the Q&A pod, or the little tab at the bottom. It says Q&A, and I will help, and possibly Shelley will help get those to our speaker, who will address them at the end. We'll be using automated transcripts for today's webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our websites within 2 weeks. And certificates of attendance will be sent out to all who attended the full session, and they can also take up to 2 weeks, and they'll be sent to you via a link in your email. So be sure, if you don't see it, to check your spam or junk folder. Sometimes it goes in there. If you'd like to know more information about what's coming up or resources, we invite you to access our social media pages. And now let's turn things over to Tim Devitt. Tim has a 30+ year commitment to providing and leading recovery-oriented mental health and substance use services, including integrated mental health and substance use treatment, permanent supported housing, assertive community treatment, and substance use outpatient and intensive outpatient programming. Tim has presented nationally and co-authored peer-reviewed journal articles and a book chapter on the integration of evidence-based practices to best meet the comprehensive needs of people with substance use and mental health conditions. Tim is a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, a lecturer at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice, the University of Chicago, and a board member of Serenity Academy, Chicago, a 501c3 with the mission to launch alternative peer groups and recovery high school in Chicago. Thank you for being with us, Tim, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
And thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, the Center for Health Enhancement Systems and Studies. Let me get my slides up here. There we go. Well, I look forward to sharing this information with you. You know, as Rebecca shared, I'll be sharing with you today information about the impact of alcohol use disorders in people with mental illness, specifically, or with specific attention to the impact on psychotic disorders, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorder, PTSD, the impact in mortality increases as we go through the COVID-19 pandemic, and then finishing up with some integrated treatment approaches that I'm hopeful will be helpful for you all to review with me. But as we get started, you know, it's important to note that, you know, it's frequent. The substance use disorders, specifically alcohol use disorders, and people with mental illness, that there's a relationship here. If you look at this slide in front of you now, you see the bar to the left, general population. About 15% of people in the general population at some point in their life have a substance use disorder. And this data is already 30 years old, but it was a landmark study. It really helped us understand that co-occurring substance use disorders are very common with people that have severe and persistent mental illness. If you go to the next bar, schizophrenia, you'll see that jumps up to about 47% of people with schizophrenia at some point in their lives will have a substance use disorder. It goes even higher for people with bipolar disorder, closer to about 55, 57%. And then the last three bars for depression and anxiety disorders, types of anxiety disorders, it's somewhere between 27 and 33% of people at some point in their lives will have a substance use disorder. And why this is important is because, you know, people with severe and persistent mental illness are more vulnerable to having substance use disorders. And they also tend to experience more catastrophic consequences from using less substances. And these include higher rates of relapse, higher rates of homelessness and incarceration, higher rates of violence and victimization and suicidal behavior, higher rates of medical problems, higher rates of family problems, higher rates of service use, and more unemployment or more employment instability. Also, so it's just important to note that when we think about people with schizophrenia and we look at the data, we see some significant outcomes that are worth sharing, that are including reduced quality of life, poor social functioning, and this includes fewer activities, reduced energy, reduced mobility, reduced functional capacity, challenges with sleep disorders, higher rates of chronic medical conditions, including hypertension, heart failure, liver failure, digestive issues, higher rates of smoking, and less involvement in physical activity, and poor adherence to medical regimens, including psychotropic medications. And these are just some examples of some of the more dire negative outcomes that are associated with substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and schizophrenia. When we move to bipolar disorder, we tend to see that there's increased severity with both manic and depressive symptoms, poor prognosis, increased suicide risk, and importantly also when it comes to aggression, that when a person's intoxicated and manic at the same time, research supports that individuals may need very little provocation to reach their threshold to act with aggression. The a related factor here with people that have schizophrenia and psychotic disorders and bipolar disorders is the increased rates of neurocognitive impairment. Now, alcohol use disorder by itself can contribute to having increased episodes of or increased deficits in neurocognitive functions, including episodic memory and attention, processing speed, physiospatial motor abilities, verbal fluency, and problem solving. And just to kind of share quickly, episodic memory is really one's ability to mentally experience life events that have happened in the preceding and following events that have happened as a result of life events. It helps us to learn from experience. It helps us to kind of create and own that personal life story. Recall these maybe more so these events that kind of shape our lives, and to be able to kind of talk about that. And there can be some impairment here with severe alcohol use disorder. And there can also be some impairment with these specific functions when people have chronic courses of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And what the literature supports is that when people have both alcohol use disorder and schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that they can have more severe widespread cognitive deficits than people who have just a single disorder. I think it's important to note that with depression, which by the way is the most common psychiatric disorder that we see in people that have an alcohol use disorder, but it's important to note that alcohol is a depressant, and it's important for us as clinicians or people who are helping people that have alcohol use disorder and depressive symptoms, that we need to distinguish between depression and alcohol-induced depression. Depressed mood and anhedonia are some of the core features that must be present for depression to be a diagnosis. And just to review, that anhedonia is a loss of interest or pleasure in activities that at one point had been enjoyed or tend to be enjoyed by most people. What's also important is, in addition to these other symptoms under depression, is to be looking for periods of depression outside periods of drinking. We'll tend to see that with people who have the depressive disorder. However, with people that stop drinking and we see a remission of these symptoms of depression, then we can conclude that there's likely more likelihood of alcohol-induced depression. We want to pay attention to these overlapping symptoms and that are noted here. And in addition, we want to be able to connect with collaterals and secure information from significant others, family members, people who spend a lot of time with the individuals that we're meeting with. Self-report can be inaccurate, and especially during periods of intoxication. So it's important to be able to secure this information. What we see, though, and I want to really emphasize this in 2 slides from now, is both with depression and alcohol-induced depression, is we see increased rates of suicidal behavior, and I'll have more on that in a moment. But I want to just quickly focus on the treatment aspect, or on the remission aspect, and that there is clear evidence that depression symptoms tend to improve with abstinence as soon as 2 to 3 weeks after a person does abstain. Especially if we see that with the induced depression from alcohol. But what we want to also pay attention to is that the research suggests that for people who have suicidal ideations, that the alcohol tends to contribute to a narrow focusing of attention on their emotional state, on their circumstances that they're going through, and that there's research to support that period of 24 hours before and after a suicide attempt. This is research looking at individuals who have had an attempt for the 24 hours before that, that acute alcohol use is often a factor in the hour given, in that hour before a person makes the ideation, or I'm sorry, engages in the behavior. And that there's a relationship perhaps between the suicidal ideation and the action that contributes to the suicidal behavior. And that's related to perhaps disinhibition. But it's important for us to pay attention to that we do see increased rates of suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, and that and it's important for us to be able to take action in our assessment and in our swift action as clinicians. In addition, to suicide and depression, bipolar disorder, we also see generalized anxiety is associated with heavier drinking and contributes to more frequent hospitalization, increased rates of relapse to substance use and treatment, increased risk of leaving treatment against medical advice. Studies also suggest that people with alcohol use disorder and anxiety tend to have worse treatment outcomes, and they may more frequently return to drinking 4 months following intensive residential treatment when the treatment protocols aren't continued. So in other words, step down, following up with continued treatment. I'm going to talk about this in a moment too, how once we get to the treatment section, that treatment, for when I refer to treatment here, I'm referencing integrated treatment. So treatment that can attend to alcohol use and the specific mental health condition. For individuals that have PTSD, it's really important to note that there's a higher frequency of people that have the alcohol use disorder with the PTSD. And there's a number of theories that are hypotheses that may contribute to this. The self-medication hypothesis basically assumes that individuals may increase their drinking to treat their symptoms of PTSD. This may include helping with sleep, helping with irritability, helping with hypervigilance, and again, it's the perceived experience of that it's helping. That isn't necessarily helping long term. Often it could be complicating these symptoms, or does complicate these symptoms of PTSD. But the perception that in the moment while the person is using, they get some relief from this. The high risk hypothesis basically says that because of the PTSD, because of the alcohol use disorder, a person may be putting themselves at higher risk for engaging in continued traumatic experiences. So higher risk behaviors, for example, may lead to more dire consequences that can contribute to more traumatic events. The susceptibility hypothesis basically assumes that alcohol use disorder can increase the risk for PTSD, that alcohol use can interfere with emotional processing after exposure to a trauma. Alcohol withdrawal symptoms can increase hyperarousal, and that it can just increase one's susceptibility. And then shared vulnerability hypothesis assumes that a person with PTSD and alcohol use disorders have similar risk factors, and that the association is non-causal. So this could include genetic factors, environmental factors, individual factors such as personality may contribute to that. I also want to emphasize that alcohol use disorder, what we've seen with alcohol use disorder and experimental illness is increased rates of mortality during the COVID pandemic. And I'm going to share a slide in a moment that shows some data. But in 2020 and in 2021, given algorithms for projected death going back the last 10 years, the rates are much higher when the pandemic came than what were expected before the pandemic actually arrived, up to 20 to 25%. And what we've tended to see is that the people who are most affected tend to also have some social determinants of health deficits that make it harder to access healthcare. There may be higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of social isolation, higher rates of unemployment as well, related to, factors that we see from those worse outcomes that I shared in the earlier slide. We tend to see that happening here. In addition, older adults have had higher mortality rates, and younger adults have had a higher or suffered a greater surge than was originally projected as well. But this slide here kind of helps tell the story a little bit more detail, in that overall, we see those two bars to the extreme right for each of these tables or graphs. We've seen increased rates of mortality overall with the general population, with women, with men, with people ages 25 to 44, with in the bottom left slide, ages middle-aged people 45 to 64, and also ages 65 and older. We've seen higher rates than were originally expected, we tend to see that the alcohol use is a factor that is contributing to this, in addition to the social determinants of health. But this is, again, specific for people that have had symptoms or disorders related to severe mental illness. We're seeing these increased rates of alcohol use disorder and mortality combined for each of these sectors in the population based on age. I'd like to take a few minutes and just also share, that there is hope that integrated treatment, and a need for integrated treatment as we continue to move forward in serving individuals that have alcohol use disorders and severe mental illness. But I start with this one slide, and I ask you to share your replies in the chat box. Does sobriety lead to a more satisfying life, or does a more satisfying life lead to sobriety? It's going to take about 5 seconds, and I'm going to continue.
I'll let you know what we see in the chat.
Thank you.
Go ahead and put your answers in. Both, I think. Everybody says both so far.
All right. Well, we're good. We're good with that. That's exactly correct. That what we tend to see is, and this is based on earlier studies going back to the late 90s into the 2000s, looked at the factors that contribute to people engaging in recovery. And these 4 dimensions of recovery actually are now really promulgated and supported on the SAMHSA by SAMHSA. They're part of the definition for recovery and what it takes to engage in recovery. But going back even 20 years ago, there was research looking at people that were homeless, or that had severe courses of mental illness, severe courses of substance use disorder. They were homeless, unemployed, not connected socially so much with other people, having poor access to healthcare, and followed them as they went through their journeys. And what was found is that as people engaged in these 4 dimensions of recovery, that substance use reduction was able to occur for people more often than when these factors were not present. And the takeaway message here is that for a lot of people, engagement in these social determinants of health precedes sobriety. It's not something that happens necessarily after sobriety, although it can if people go into intensive treatment and achieve sobriety. But the lasting change occurs as people engage and maintain these 4 dimensions of recovery. And I share this because it's a significant part of the treatment that we want to focus on with individuals that are experiencing more severe courses of severe mental illness. There's a lot of literature to support that. The evidence-based practices for severe mental illness include components of integrated treatment that address developing or enhancing these dimensions of recovery with individuals. And we often see that, based on a stage-based approach, we need to use motivational approaches, assertive approaches, comprehensive approaches, committing to long-term perspective, not having time limits, and really wrap around support through the structure of a multidisciplinary team. Some of you may be familiar with integrated dual disorders treatment or integrated treatment for co-occurring disorders, but this is an evidence-based practice model that emphasizes stage-based interventions, meeting people where they're at based on their stage of readiness to address treatment, engaging in outreach outside of center-based care in the community, offering practical assistance to address these dimensions of recovery, motivational interviewing, of course, offering substance use counseling and recovery management, especially as people move forward in the stages of change from early contemplation into preparation and action. Offering dual disorders group, mutual aid groups, family psychoeducation with the emphasis on helping family become optimal supports for an individual, pharmacological treatment that addresses both disorders, and important access to physical health approaches, and harm reduction here in that before a person may commit to sobriety, really addressing whatever kind of, all of these really addressing treatment approaches that help the person make some forward movement in their life, make any positive change. And often that can be with physical health before they're committed to sobriety. Medication was one of the points mentioned with integrated treatment, and note that when used with psychosocial approaches, to treatment for addiction are very important in addressing alcohol use disorder. And share this because historically medications for alcohol use disorder have been underutilized in mental health centers and in organizations, places that serve people with co-occurring mental health and alcohol use disorder. And research supports that some of these factors are both on the patient. There's patient barriers for underutilization and also more structural barriers to underutilization. Some of these patient barriers include some of the cognitive impairment that we mentioned, amotivation, not believing that this is going to help or is necessary. Again, this is for MAT, for alcohol use disorder. Lack of trust in treatment institutions. There may be cultural beliefs too. There may be messages that are promulgated in culture, that may be promulgated in recovery culture too, that alcohol use disorder medications are not helpful, or that are not, it's replacing one drug with another drug, the medication. Provider stigma can also be a factor in this area. Underutilization of structural barriers include limited provider training, under identification, with the substance use disorder being a factor, and more attributing it to the mental illness condition, and lack of integrated services for treating both disorders together. What's really also important and hopeful to note is that the research supports that mutual aid can be very beneficial for individuals that have severe courses of mental illness. Individuals with psychotic disorders have been shown to benefit from 12-step meetings, specific the psychoeducation part. But I want to emphasize that not so much with AA. If they're actively with symptoms, if they have active symptoms of psychosis. But what does seem to really help are groups that emphasize both disorders. So depending on your community, they may refer to these as Dual Disorders Anonymous group, Dual Recovery Anonymous. I know back 20 years ago in different parts of the country, they were referred to as Double Trouble groups. I don't see that so much anymore, but the emphasis on being with peers that are, some of whom are engaged in longer term recovery for both disorders, who can be present in meetings and share hope, convey expectancy, and introduce this 12-step model for recovery for both disorders. I also just want to share a few slides that have to, or some resources here that have to do with that comprehensive component of integrated treatment that was noted in the integrated treatment disorder slide. Support employment, helping people secure employment based on their preference, based on what it is that they're wanting to do, and helping to create that opportunity for them. There's a great resource here on support employment of the individual's placement support model from the Individual Placement Support Institute in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Also, assertive community treatment. The Indiana ACT Center there in Indiana also has lots of information on assertive community treatment for individuals that have severe mental illness and co-occurring substance use disorders. And then also supported housing. This idea of like helping people establish and have housing. There's a tremendous amount of research going back to the early 2000s from Pathways to Housing in New York City, looking at helping people with dual disorders who are not yet committed to sobriety necessarily, securing housing and permanent housing and assisting them with practical assistance. And some of this ACT model or assertive community treatment model implemented there, helping people though at very high rates, over 90% people maintaining in their housing. But the Corporation for Supported Housing also has wonderful information on how to implement and how to support people in maintaining in their permanent supported housing, again with a focus here on mental illness and substance use disorder. I think we have about 2 or 3 minutes. I want to just
we do, and we have
excellent.
We have 2 questions, so let's try them really quickly. Gary Hall asks, do researchers expect to see generalized anxiety disorder increase because of the COVID-19 pandemic and gun violence, attacks on institutions, etc., will eventually lead to increase of SUD, particularly alcohol-related problems?
I would have to agree based on just what we're seeing in the field that absolutely there is anxiety, and it's for good reason. There's concern about people's well-being, and I can't speak to what the research is saying, but I think that's something that we do definitely need to be paying attention to. So thank you for that, Gary.
And Susan asks, did the length of treatment affect the outcome or have an impact on recovery? If so, do you have a rough idea of the length of time?
It's a really good question. And what I can share with you is that when it's specific to the integrated dual disorders treatment, one of the components of that model is to offer time unlimited care. But that doesn't mean that the intensity of that time unlimited care will always be the same. It can fluctuate, and it can decrease over time. And it may so be that a person achieves long-term remission or sustained remission from a substance use disorder and experiences improvement with symptoms from a mental illness, and may benefit more from our check-ins or from some coaching over time, and may not need the more intensive services. But we do tend to see that in the field, that people definitely can move forward in recovery and not need as much, especially as they start working, getting involved in more significant relationships, and having a higher quality of life.
Well, Tim, we've reached our allotted time. I want to say thank you so much for sharing this information. Remind people that we will be posting the recording along with the slides again on our website. And I hope that you all will think about joining us. We are not meeting in July. We're taking July off, but our next meeting will be on August 2nd with Chris Kelly, and she's the manager of the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence. So everyone, thank you for being with us today. And I will be following up with certificates of attendance for those who have been here for the entire presentation. Have a wonderful day.